All right, so last we left off, our heroes had lost their land, but had been granted the blessing to come back home and settle in this new Babylonian province called Yehud, and really became a Persian province when Persia overthrew the Babylonian kingdom, Babylonian Empire. So the Babylonian king Nabopolassar became the first king of Babylon around 626 BC. And I'm going to throw up something for you here. If you are a fan of toxic masculinity, you may like the next couple chapters. There's some good stuff. So it's a rather adventurous affair here as we see the Persian Empire take over and start to expand, and what happens and how it transforms the landscape here. The Jewish nation is now just residing in a Persian province here, and we talked about this in the first week that this is really kind of a setting of the table that's happening during this time, and they are just kind of getting themselves back together. So if you think about what happened, their capital had been destroyed, their temple had been destroyed, they'd been scattered all over the countryside, in some cases enslaved, especially the Assyrians, and so leaders like Ezra were actually appointed by the king to go back and organize the Jewish writings. And this is where we believe the Jewish Bible really started to become assimilated and started to become organized into the form that we have today, is under Ezra. So before that, it was a series of writings they had carried along with them. If you think about it, at this time, they didn't have all of the writings, right? They might not have had the writings, the book of Daniel, for instance, and Ezra and Nehemiah. These things were just still unfolding during this time. So you have this active effort to organize the church, restore it, and start to rebuild itself spiritually. And we looked at it as kind of like a cleansing that took place. And so what came out the other side was God's people in a more of a purified form. So when when Nabopolassar came up here and overthrew the Median Empire and then the Persian Empire. Remember that prophecy in Daniel of the ram with the two horns? One was a small horn. We know that to be the Median Empire, and then the Persian Empire under under Cyrus the Great. That would become the big horn that Daniel was talking about. So we see these things starting to unfold here. And during this tumultuous time when the Babylonian Empire was overthrown, Nineveh, which was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, remember they were taken over by the Babylonians. That Nineveh was still the capital there, and it was completely destroyed and its population massacred. That's mainly blamed on the Medes, the small horn, not so much the Babylonians. In fact, the Babylonian king, there's evidence there that he openly lamented that the town was destroyed, that this happened. That was really the act of the Medes. And so the Medes then were kind of overthrown and taken over by the Persians. So it became the Persian Empire, for lack of a better term. So you have this new balance. This is where the story picks up. So now you have Persia, this huge country to the north. The Jews are in this province here in the middle. Egypt's down here. And Egypt was always the superpower. They started to really get worried about this. And so we saw this battle taking place back and forth. Interesting point. Nabopolassar, who was a ancestor of Nebuchadnezzar, they think he came from the same place that Abraham came from. What was a Chaldean? Yeah. So there were several towns that were part of Chaldea. Uruk. There's a few others I can't pronounce. So they're thinking that these people came from that same area. That's a very interesting thing. And then they came up, took over Persia, and they're the ones that then released the Jews to go home. So isn't that kind of interesting? Maybe there was a centuries-old family connection there somewhere. But that's actually kind of interesting. So Nabopolassar, he was succeeded by Nebuchadnezzar II, who was, as we know, was a friend of Daniel, and he came to accept the majesty of God on a couple of different occasions. And he was a pretty powerful king that created some stability, allowed the Jews to return home. He was succeeded by Nebuchadnezzar II. Oh, we talked about that. So Nebuchadnezzar II was succeeded by this guy named Marduk, who was credited with releasing King Jeconiah from prison. So we see these people coming along after the Assyrians that were credited with kind of like helping out the Jews and helping them kind of, be restored a little bit. Now, here's where things really get to be crazy. We start to see this cycle happen over and over again. He only ruled for a couple of years. He was overthrown and murdered by his brother-in-law, one of Nebuchadnezzar's generals. And I would say probably for the next 200 years, 250 years, you'll see this cycle over and over again in the Babylonian Persian history, where if you became king, if you were the brother of somebody who became king, your life expectancy was pretty short. I mean, there was one example of a Persian king who had 150 brothers. When he became king, he had all his brothers killed. I mean, there's this is the way these people behave. I mean, there was a lot of just wrestling and wrangling for the throne. And so we'll look forward a few hundred years, we'll see that really makes them right for some bad stuff to happen down the line. So this is a cycle that starts to begin here after Nebuchadnezzar's gone. Remember, they're still Babylonian at this point. And then this general reigned for 4 years. He was succeeded by his son, who we think might have had him assassinated. He would only last for a few months. He gets deposed. He's likely killed by this other guy named Nebuchadnezzar, probably because he wasn't of a royal heritage. You see this continual history of people wrestling for the throne. And then his son, Belshazzar, acted as regent. He was a crown prince. Anybody remember that name? Belshazzar.
Isn't there a musical piece about? I might be wrong. Okay.
May have been.
I have to look it up.
Okay.
About the story.
Belshazzar. Interesting story around Belshazzar. Writing on the wall. So this is the last. Now the Bible refers to him as a king. He technically was a crown prince, regent. The king, his father, had gone into self-exile. Belshazzar had been responsible for murdering the prior king so that his father could become king. And this is a bad guy. I mean, if you understand how bad this guy is, you start to understand the whole handwriting on the wall context there. This was a bad guy. And he was like, since he had his father's predecessor killed, and the father may have been kind of out of it. We kind of think he might have been a little out of it. So this guy gets all the loot. He gets all the treasure. He's the one that benefits financially from this and acts essentially as king. The father kind of goes off into a self-imposed exile. So Belshazzar is acting as king. And does anybody remember that story there in the book of Daniel? How does this happen?
Oh, it brings in the goblets and everything out of the big feast. Brings in the goblets from the temple.
Yeah.
Starts worshiping the other gods.
Yeah, so remember back from before, Nebuchadnezzar II had destroyed the temple, right? And sacked it, took everything out. Got all the good stuff, had destroyed the place. So you got all this, the golden chalices and bowls, and all the things that were the really worth, valuable things at a temple. Well, the Babylonians have those. So he throws a party one day. It's kind of like the guy that goes on the internet and flashes his money and he's got his gold chains and look how wealthy. He's that kind of guy, right? So he has a big flashy party and look how powerful I am. We're going to toast our gods with the Jews' goblet, right? This is an arrogant guy, right? So in the middle of this party, what happens? A hand appears and writes on the plaster. That's kind of interesting. I mean, it writes into the plaster. Could you imagine you got this big party going on and all of a sudden this hand shows up and just starts writing on the wall and words that nobody understands. Nobody understands these words. And so what happens?
There's a woman of some sort that remembers Daniel.
Yeah, I think it's his queen, maybe.
I think it's the queen.
And she says, hey, there's a guy that was a friend of your grandfather who could read, who helped him out. So here we go back into remember back in the days, the Egyptians, there was a pharaoh who didn't know Joseph, Kind of the same thing here. Here's a king who didn't know Daniel, basically. But Daniel's still alive, so he says, well, get him in here. Let's, I'll throw a robe on him and a gold chain around his neck if he can tell what this means. And so he comes in and he tells Daniel what? He says, I'll make you a high official. I'll put a purple robe on you, put a gold rope, chain around your neck. If you can tell what this means. What's Daniel say?
Says no, thank you.
You can keep all that stuff. Give it to somebody else. Here's what it means. Basically, you've been weighed and measured and found wanting, and tonight your kingdom will be asked of you. And it came to an end. That was the very time which the Medes attacked destroyed Babylon. So he was the last leader of Babylon. Fantastic story there about how God brought these arrogant people down. So Babylon's overthrown by Persians under Cyrus the Great, 539 BC. Now we start to see the story of the Jews kind of fade into the background, and they now are just kind of getting themselves organized down in Ehud. Cyrus founds what's called the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire, by defeating the Medians, consolidating them both into one. Remember the ram with two horns? This is that prophecy happening here. And this is the second great horn that came up. Something very interesting happens here now. Remember we said that Egypt becomes very paranoid, and there have been battles taking place here. Cyrus is the one that initiates the effort to take over Egypt. And actually, at the eventual high watermark of their empire, Persia controls Egypt, all of the Middle East, almost all of Asia Minor, out to about here. So all of this is the Persian Empire, clear over to the limits of India here and the mountains to the north. So they basically go as far as man can possibly extend in that time. So very powerful land empire the Persians create. And the Persians, especially under the Cyrus, he is thought of very, very highly amongst the Jews. In fact, I think even in Jerusalem there might be there's a main avenue named after him. He's looked at very, very favorably. Very tolerant. Really helped and promoted them to have peace and stability. And I mean, think about it. Remember, you had all this war going on. Now you've got Egypt to subdue, taken care of, and they can just kind of sit here and stew and get themselves back together again. So Cyrus was very, very successful. Brought all of Asia, most of Asia Minor, all the Middle East into the empire, and we start to see the Aramaic language here now. The language of Jesus and his disciples become the official language. I wonder, where did this language Aramaic even come from? How did that happen? That happened during this time. He solidified. Remember, you got this massive area, right? Imagine all the languages being spoken all over here. He actually organizes this one language that this is going to be our language. And Aramaic now becomes the official language of the Persian Empire. Even to the point when, centuries later, the Greeks and the Romans come in and take over, Aramaic is still the language that's entrenched, and that's the language. So this is where this is established. It's under Cyrus the Great. So the Jews now take this as their own language, and this becomes the daily language spoken on the streets by the people. So 500 years later, Jesus and disciples, this will be the language they speak. Cyrus is thought of and written of, very positively in the books of Ezra, Isaiah, and others. And this is where we start to see the writing start to kind of peter out a little bit at this time. And probably over the next 100 years, we'll start to see the prophetic writing start to wind down. So Cyrus the Great dies in 530 BC, and about this same time, something is brewing way to the west. What do you think's cooking out there? Look out to the west. No, this is a couple hundred years before him. Hang tight on that. Hang tight on that. That's next week. So we're at 500 BC now. So you've had settlements, you've had populations grow. Rome's been in effect. Rome's been in place 750, 800 BC, something like that. But it's had kings. Greece. All these little city-states, never organized. Rome was a city-state, never organized. You had all these different kings. Athens and Rome start to toy with this idea of getting rid of our kings. We start to toy this idea. Maybe they looked over, maybe they saw what was going on over and said, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Maybe we have a better way. And so you start to see philosophies come along that had not been ever really thought of before. The idea of a democracy, the idea of people voting, the idea of having a republic, the idea of throwing away your king and replacing him with something else. This starts to happen out here to the west, outside of this, right? You've got kind of peace and harmony. Remember, sometimes you need a strong man to have peace. That's what you had here, right? You have a strong man that keeps peace, right? Because out here you've got all kinds of conflict. But it's conflict to find a different way forward. So around 500 BC, a man by the name of Brutus. I think he had 3 names. His last name was Brutus. Does that name sound familiar to you? It's not the same Brutus. It's his ancestor. Coincidentally enough. Leads a revolt to overthrow the king of Rome. So about 500 BC, we see Rome transform into a republic from a kingdom. These are important because these will have effects 500 years later on the people living here. This is why we have to kind of think about it. What happened out there? So we have this overthrowing of the king in Rome. It becomes a republic, starts to transform into a republic. We have the same thing happening here. Now, Greece was a series of city-states. You have Eretria, Athens, Corinth, Sparta, a bunch of them. You had some kingdoms like Macedonia. They're all run by kings, and they start to transform a little bit. Athens starts to transform into a democracy during this time. And it's really interesting to think about. Big land power here, right? What's this look like?
Sea power.
Yeah. This isn't really a... this is something else, isn't it? And if you look at a map of this area, what's it look like? Just thousands of little islands scattered all along here. So they get their dominance and their energy through trade, maritime trade, navy, and they start to expand. And now remember, Persia had probably only gone, this is very mountainous. Here you see a map of Turkey. It's very, very, very mountainous. So it's kind of hard to move around here. These guys in their boats just settle all this, and they set up all these little Greek city-states all over the place, just scattered all over the place. You've got democracy. You've got philosophy starting. They start to think about things differently. They're starting to generate this idea of reasoning and this idea of fate, right? The idea of self-destiny versus property of the king, right? They start to have all these ideas percolating that are total opposite to the way these people live and work over here. So you have this, I mean, it's the ultimate, like, you know, Cold War situation. You've got democracy and communism, or you've got these opposing views. And a bunch of Greeks setting up all around here that came from Athens, right? They're setting up, and then what do these guys start doing? They start moving this way, and these guys are moving this way, and what happens? Conflict. Yeah, you start to have the beginnings of what we know now as the Greco-Persian Wars. Last for quite a long time, very, very intense. But again, the Persians were very tolerant of other religions. I mean, that was the thing. You had stability. You didn't really have like mass persecution and things like that going on. There was slavery, but it wasn't like there was. They had kind of reached the limits of their expansion and were kind of looking for stability. And they did have revolts all over the place. They were more interested in putting down that kind of stuff. The Jews weren't revolting. There was no record that the Jews ever revolted against the Babylonians or the Persians at this point. They were happy to just kind of go home and rebuild the house. So these little city-states kind of operated as little tiny separate little kingdoms or little tiny republics. Big threat to the east here. They would fight amongst themselves every once in a while until what? Until these guys came over. Once these guys, then they all band together and fight back. And that's what happened a couple times. Persia actually managed to control everything from Thrace and down here. Once you get down here, if you ever look at a map, look at a map of Greece. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got all these little isthmuses. Is that the plural for isthmus? Isthmuses and mountainous areas, and it's just, it would be really, really difficult to invade this. But you end up with this huge conflict boiling up to the point to where King Darius I of Persia finally decides, I'm going to take these guys out. There's a lot of trouble, a lot of fighting over this area right here where the Greeks have settled. And imagine this, these are like your brother in here, getting destroyed, enslaved. You have a lot of trouble going on. So Darius finally says, I'm going to take these guys out. And we talked last week about the Battle of Marathon. Battle of Marathon happens right here. I do need to correct myself about that. I misspoke on something on the Battle of Marathon. Remember the guy that runs back and falls over dead? Okay. What had happened was the Greeks land here, and in the Bay of Marathon, and they get kind of bottled up. So they decide, we're going to send a fleet, and we're going to come around. Well, we're going to defeat the Greeks here, and we're going to sail around. We're going to defeat Athens. We're going to come at it from both directions. Now imagine Athens is thinking, okay, we're going to get destroyed. I mean, there's a huge fleet, 100,000 Greeks or Persians. We're going to get destroyed. So the men all go out to fight. The men show up at Marathon to fight. The women and children are back home, and the pact they had made was, if the men get destroyed up here, the women and children all kill themselves. And that was the pact they made. And so when the Persians leave, half their people come around, leave half of them there, that half that stays behind gets defeated. So that's when they send the runner back and say, go back and tell them we won. The Persians aren't coming. And so this guy runs back to say, victory, basically, and then falls over dead. So basically, the whole point of that was, you don't need to kill yourselves, we won. Imagine that kind of society where you're living on that knife's edge. That's crazy. So Darius gets defeated. His son, Xerxes, he's pretty upset about this. He becomes king. He determines himself, I'm going to pay back these Greeks, and he launches a massive, full-scale, give it everything you got invasion of Greece. I don't know if you know this area here, but there's no land that connects here. It's called the Hellespont. Have you ever heard of that? So the Hellespont, it's where the Battle of Gallipoli was fought during World War I. He builds, now it's a few miles across here. It's pretty narrow, but it's maybe a couple miles. It's not very far, but it's water. He builds a bridge of pontoons. We're a couple miles across that, take his entire army across. Right, we're not going to do this by ocean anymore. We're going to take the army across. He takes his army across, conquers, gets all the way down. Now Athens is going to get destroyed. I mean, this massive army. This is where the Battle of Thermopylae happens, right? The Persians win that, but to great glory to the Persians, right? It's a great story, but the Persians do win that. They're coming. Athens, the Etria gets conquered, destroyed. Athens, they evacuate. The Persians come down, take the city, destroy the city. I mean, this is a bad time. This is it's like a world war. This is their version of a world war, right? Total, the city's being destroyed, massive invasions and things like that happening. So, this is about 480 BC. So Xerxes is successful in overrunning most of Greece, eventually sacking, burning Athens. But then the Persians are destroyed at the Battle of Salamis, which is a naval battle. Happens up in here. And that's when the Persians are eventually, their invasion is eventually destroyed. So Athens does. And then, you know what happens? They figure, we're gonna go crazy. We're going to come down, the Athenians come down here and invade Egypt. This gets crazy. It's like a world war. They invade Egypt. Now, the Persians are a land power, right? They are a massive land power. And so they are able to actually come down, imagine saying an army all the way down here in 450 BC. I mean, how hard that would be. But they defeat the Athenians, are completely wiped out, and that creates a balance of power and ends the Greco-Persian War. So you have about 50 years of just non-stop carnage during this time. So you have this constant thing of Greeks unite, counterattack, Persians invade, Greeks unite, counterattack, and all that's happening with the backdrop that the Greeks are developing this philosophy and this political system that will eventually take over all of the Western world. I mean, the Romans will even borrow a lot of the philosophies from Athens and from the Greek philosophers like Aristotle and people like that. So, thoughts, comments so far? What's happened? What's the story? What's happened here? A lot of battle history, but what's happened?
God's setting it up.
Okay, but what's he setting up? Yeah, what's he setting up? What is it that's what's transpiring? Think about the reason we talked about Daniel last week. What was the after the ram with the two horns? What happens? Anybody remember? What's that? The goat
from Greece
with a big horn, who's really ticked off. Remember that? And remember it says he comes with great rage, and he leaps, right? So you see that all being, you see the context of that. You see the historical backdrop for that. You've had mainly almost your entire country destroyed, right? A lot of people taken back as slaves. You've had some really bad stuff happen here. This guy's going to come along in a little bit of time and exact revenge on that. That's what Daniel's prophesied. And that happens about 100 years later, about 120 years later. So you start to see this playing out of, there's a few things. Number one, you start to see philosophies come here. And if you think about it, we talked about this on the first week, that if you didn't have these philosophies percolate and get entrenched here and then get spread everywhere, you might have trouble going later on with the apostles and disciples.
Aren't these philosophies destroying all the gods?
Yeah.
Kind of bringing it to sort of one idea instead of many, many gods everywhere?
I don't know about that. I don't think so, because I think what happens, especially later on, this is when the Christians get themselves in trouble with the Romans later on, is
True.
The Romans were all about, well, hey, the emperor is just another god. We already have 1,000 gods. What difference does it make if you worship the emperor?
Yeah.
What's the difference? Come on, can't you do that? They didn't understand the Christians were one God, right? Didn't understand it. And
Well,
I
maybe
think
it's just adding other philosophies to changing people's minds.
well, and also remember we said this is very important to understand, because the Persians established this sense of tolerance. And there was a rich history here. Remember what history we've been talking about? When the Greeks grow up and they see this big thing to the east, they actually admire that. They admired Cyrus the Great. They admired these great leaders who accomplished things. And when he eventually takes over, they adopt a lot of those philosophies of tolerance. Alexander the Great actually took on a lot of Persian philosophies. In fact, it's written that he dressed himself up as a Persian king. Things like he made himself Persian basically. So they try to adopt that. So you see these things pop up that God uses, right? Tolerance. Is that BNC? ANC. The philosophies, some governing principles. Right? You see things starting to happen out here that eventually make the eventual ministry of the disciples possible, right? That would have been very difficult to do in the days of the Babylon.
Well, when Daniel prophesies all of this, in verse 26 it says, "But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion. Then the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people." So it's allowing the people, and it says then, "and the saints of the Most High, and his kingdom is an everlasting." So maybe it's getting the people ready and prepared to understand who God is.
Yeah, that you can be, that you
It's
have
not
value.
the king
Yeah,
anymore, or these gods anymore. It's the people now.
yeah. And that you as an individual have value. That you are important, as opposed to you're just a chess piece. You sacrifice, right? That takes. I mean, it takes centuries for that philosophy to sink in. Now, I've thought a lot about this. We live in an age that had our Renaissance. We had a Renaissance, 500 years ago. That's Renaissance means rebirth, right? So it's a rebirth of the way you think. And every once in a while, societies have to be reborn in the way they think. Otherwise, it's not possible to do. Well, I look at parts of the world that have never had a Renaissance. They haven't gone through a Renaissance. You can tell. You can say, well, you haven't gone through the same rebirth of thinking that our society did. So we don't understand each other. As a result, no bad people. We just think differently. So what you have to have, if you're going to go out and preach a philosophy of that a woman can be a leader, a woman's slave has value. Can you imagine that? You're going to go and you're going to teach that. If you look at the hierarchical ranking, right? You had citizen, soldier, slave, man, woman. You had all these hierarchical things. You're working with that. You're going to come along here and start to preach that everybody is equal. What's it take to make that even happen? You want people to swallow that, understand that? You have to start changing the way people think. Now, these guys weren't there yet, but they launched this idea of, let's think about things. Let's think things differently, right? Let's start to question things. That's what was happening here. And Alexander is a student of Aristotle. He was a student of Plato. So these guys all launched this idea of just question and think about it, question and think about it, question and think about it, versus follow orders, right? So you had to have that to come up to build on later. And they still didn't understand. It took centuries, right? The Romans hadn't quite gotten that far yet because they lost the Republic. Spoiler alert. So we talked about this. Around 460 BC, Athens tries to free Egypt. That fails. And so what you end up with is a stalemate with a massive land power over here and a naval power over here. And they start to understand they are, their way of thinking might be superior because they stood up and they start to really think about things differently. And shortly after this, though, they'll break into something called the Peloponnesian War. Maybe you've heard of that. It was a war to try and unite or overrun some of these. So these guys fought amongst themselves, like they had their own little civil war many times. That was pretty bad. But now that Persia has given up trying to invade Greece, they just descend in this cycle of king gets killed, king is killed, king is killed, and it goes on for probably about another 130 years before the Greeks finally are strong enough to come back in and take them out. So that's going to take another 100 years for them to unite and come back together strong. And you see that on your timeline. If you look at your timeline, let's have it on here. This one right here. This just has the 1104 rule from 605 to 70. So now we can see this is the point at which the biblical writings that we have today, what the Jews use today as their Bible, just completely went silent. At this point, it goes pretty much silent. The last prophets have written, it's been assembled, and at this point it just goes quiet. So what was happening here is the backdrop for these final prophets. Just if you read Malachi and you read these last ones, what's kind of the message of those? George, you did a good study. What do you remember the message of those last few prophets, what they're saying? Remember that?
We're talking about things that come, forecasting things coming.
Yeah, it's a forecast, but it's not a repent anymore, right? It's not Jeremiah. It's not Isaiah and Jeremiah anymore. It sounds and reads differently. It's more of like a future. It's looking down the road, right? You can almost tell it's like it's closing out its chapter, And so that's the backdrop in which you have this massive struggle between Persia and Greece. And then what's going to happen is Greece then comes in. We're going to see this next week. Comes in, just takes over. What happens when Greece takes over the land that Israel's that the Jews are living in? What happens to their homeland when this thing finally reaches them again in about 330 BC? What are your thoughts about that? A lot of history. Think about the New Testament and think about where these things are popping up now, right? That didn't exist necessarily in the Old Testament.
I think of the scripture talks about in the fullness of time. Jesus comes. A lot of things happening, you see it kind of coming together. And finally, when the Romans get here, I guess, you get the roads, you get the postal systems, you get the common language, more or less, things are coming together.
Yeah. The fullness of time. So we talked about that first week. We've got to kind of set everything up so that it's possible for Jesus to do what he's going to do. Was it possible to do it? Yeah, God could accomplish anything, but man, is it a lot easier if we set it up right? Right? It's a lot easier to have a nice banquet if I set the table and clean the house and have the food prepared, right? It's easier to have a banquet. I can have a banquet, but it'll kind of be a lousy experience for everybody, right? If I don't prepare it ahead of time. That's what's had a lot of preparation. I mean, think about what Jesus is going to do, what's going to happen here. But for all Israel's history before that, everything had kind of happened here, right? Where's it going to happen after Jesus? Everywhere. So we have to allow that we have to have the mechanism for that to explode out of here. So now it just can't be It just can't be what happens here. It's got to be, well, this is the center of gravity. This becomes the center of gravity for 200 years, 300 years. This becomes the center of philosophy, thought, language, trade, wealth. It becomes a center of gravity. And then this becomes, see how it's just moving out? This becomes a center of gravity. Look at a map of Rome. Look at a map of how far Rome finally went. That has to be established for the church to go that way. Right?
I've got a question. So from about 430 till Christ was born, was it one main head government then? Was it
No.
basically, or was there a lot of fighting
No,
during that time?
A lot of fighting. What we're going to see is from about...
Okay, what did the Jewish people see during that time? Did they see a lot of fighting there as well, or did they just kind of see one giant government come in after another?
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, great question. Real quick, in a nutshell, from about this end of this war to 330 BC, it's Persian rule. From about 330 to, well, 330 to, we're going to say about 63 BC, it's Greek, but it's fragmented Greek.
Okay.
You ever heard of the Maccabean revolt?
Yes.
That all happens during this time.
Okay.
So what happens is, remember the Daniel philosophy, Daniel prophecy that the big horn's going to come in. And what's going to happen after he comes in?
4.
It shatters into 4 horns.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happens. We're going to see next week. There's 4 kings. His kingdom gets broken up into 4 kingdoms by his 4 leading generals. They fight a lot. This fighting over this happens. Oh, they find themselves in the back and forth in the middle of this over and over and over again.
Well, Cleopatra was part of those 4 generals too, right? Or was she right
She
before
was
that?
mixed up in the middle of that.
Okay.
She was mixed up in the middle of that. Yeah, till about 167 BC, it's Greek.
Okay. And then it's Roman.
167 to about 63 BC, it's called the Hasmonean Empire. This is that, remember I mentioned a couple times, there's about a 100-year period of time where the Jews get their king back. This is this.
Okay.
This is after the Maccabean revolt. They get their kingdom back for about 100 years, and they do something really stupid. Anybody know what they do? They have a little civil war, and they call somebody for help.
Oh,
Have we seen this before? Have we seen this happen before? Who is the dumbest person you could call for help on this map? Rome. They called Rome and said, hey, can you come down and settle this dispute for us? They go, sure, I can help settle that dispute for you.
Yeah.
Shows up with an army.
Well, take it
Shows up with
all
an
while
army.
we're at it.
And they never leave. Yeah. And so basically they're like, if you call us back, you don't want us back. You don't want us back here. And of course they come back in about 100 years and the level of place. So they're caught in the middle of this.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I just kind of wondered what kind of a
It wasn't peace.
mindset it was. It was just wars after wars after wars.
Yeah, this is the bad spot, the Maccabean revolt, which we'll look at in a couple weeks. When that happens, that's pretty bad. And then Daniel prophesies that. He prophesies the one horn gets really bad. Remember that? It gets big and it defiles the people. That's the Maccabean situation. Yeah, good question. Anything else? Wrap us up. Anything interesting or not? It's interesting to see how these different players come in. So we're going to see how the Greek language comes in. We're going to see that next week. Then of course we've already kind of teased a little bit how the Romans ended up coming in. Thanks for. Any other thoughts, questions? Yes, sir.
God's timing was just right,
Oh yeah.
always. But Christ couldn't come earlier or later. Christ had come in the Second World War.
Yeah, imagine that.
Well, it couldn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
Or direction.
Yeah.
So this is the exact time that he could have most impact on the world.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think right on here. One of the things they did here was they developed a language that would almost be perfect for this.
Universal. Yeah.
Hebrew's not the best language, probably for this. Aramaic, right? These guys sitting out by themselves, thinking about things, challenging things, develop this language that's so easy to understand what the meaning of things. You'll see the preacher do this all the time. The original Greek for this, and it means this, right? It's so good to see that. So they developed that. Well, that came out of here. Well, how did that get over here? Right? God provided the avenue for that to happen. And then how do you get from here out to the rest of the world? These guys provide the avenue for that to happen.
And what's cool about the Greeks, everything from all the other big power plays, whatever was really important, they stole and turned it into Greek, and then we all know it.
Yeah, that's right.
Pythagorean's theorem,
Yeah.
radius, on and on
Yeah.
and on,
Yeah.
knowledge of math.
Everybody kind of stole something from somebody else. Yeah, the Greeks
But
stole
they
something.
put it into Greek, which everybody knew.
That's right. Well, thank you all very, very much. So next week we're going to look at the rise of Greece and how Greece takes us over here, and how these guys end up being, how the language gets over, and how this ends up being part of Greece. So that's what we're going to look at next week. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate y'all.